Okay, so we are 3 minutes past the hour. We're nearing 30 participants. I guess we can get started. Thank you everyone for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Jeremy Boy, as I put in the chat. I'm happy to introduce very briefly here this session. It's the third out of 4 webinars out of a mini series on data-powered positive deviance. We've already gone through the work done in Somalia and in Ecuador. Today, we're looking at the work done in Mexico on identifying safer public spaces for women in Mexico City. I'll do a quick round of introductions. So everyone on the core data-powered positive deviance team, if you can please turn your cameras on. I see Andreas Pavelke's camera is on. Andy is a consultant with GIZ on the project. We have Basma Albana from the University of Manchester. I think Catherine Vogel from the GIZ Data Lab is on as well. And then from the team in Mexico, we have Gabriela Rios, who's with the UNDP Accelerator Lab in Mexico. We have Alejandra Cervantes, who's with GIZ Mexico. We have Alma Rangel, sorry for the pronunciation here, from Codeando. And we have Itzel Palma, also from Codeando. So welcome everyone. I hope you enjoy the session. Please note that it's being recorded. So good thing is that you'll be able to get the recording later. If you are uncomfortable with this, at least you know. And with that, over to you, Andy. Enjoy, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, and hi, everyone. So before we talk about the pilot, there's 2 things we need to do. So one is I'll briefly say a few words about the initiative, and then I hand it over to Basma, who will introduce you to the method. So as you might know by now, DPPD, or Data Powered Positive Deviance, is both an initiative and a method. So the method, as I just said, Basma will introduce you to, and the global initiative, or the initiative is actually a global alliance of organizations, including the GIZ Data Lab, the UNDP Accelerator Labs network, the University of Manchester, and UN Global Pulse Lab Jakarta. And so all of these organizations have specific expertise, deep expertise in specific niche areas that is needed or required to actually make DPPD work. So from ethnographic field work to data crunching to specific domain expertise. And when we set up the initiative, we knew we had to test the method in different contexts, in different countries, different regions. And so we did that. And as Jamie just mentioned, 4 of these pilots were presenting this webinar series. So we had Somaliland, we had Ecuador, today is Mexico, and on Thursday there's Niger. And so all of these pilots are very different, so different contexts, different challenges, different sort of settings they work in, different sectors, but all of them share one common philosophy or idea, which is that number one, there's we believe that solutions out there that actually work and that you can actually identify in large data sets. Most of the data work today is being done on problem analysis, so analyzing data to better understand the phenomenon. And in our case, what we're trying to do is find signals or signals in the data that point us to solutions. And so this is essentially the work that these 4 pilots are doing. And with that, I'm handing it over to Basma Albana, who is a researcher at the University of Manchester and one of the masterminds behind the concept. Over to you, Basma.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. And I'm sorry for those of you who have to hear this presentation for the 3rd time. So just to begin, what is positive deviance? So positive deviance is an asset-based approach that is based on the observation that there are individuals or communities who are able to achieve better outcomes than their peers, despite facing similar challenges. Those individuals are referred to as positive deviants, and scaling their practices and strategies is referred to as the positive deviance approach. The increasing datafication of development and the growing availability of digital data sets that could capture the outcomes of individuals or communities or spaces led us to ask the question of how can we leverage the positive deviance approach using big data? But in order to be able to answer this question and proceed with this quest, it was important to identify at the beginning the opportunities and the limitations of using big data in positive deviance. So the positive deviance approach, or the conventional methods, rely mainly on primary data collection in order to identify positive deviants and understand their underlying behaviors, a process that involves significant time, cost, and risk. And the opportunity that comes with big data, that it's existing data that can be collected at a low cost, and it can help us reduce the initial time to identify those positive deviants. Another value of using big data is its geographical coverage. So the large geographical coverage of big data enables us to identify a larger sample of positive deviants who are rare to find. And by finding larger positive deviants, a larger sample of positive deviants, it's easier to make generalizations from the conclusions. It also enables us to look into units of analysis that are beyond individuals. So we can look into villages, communities, or even regions. And the availability of big data, big data is usually available and has a longitudinal coverage. And this longitudinal coverage enables us to identify performance over time and see performance in a dynamic way. And finally, there is a value that we came to realize as we were applying the DPPD method, is that it enables us to employ a systemic lens when we look into positive deviance and try to understand it. So we're not looking into just individual level factors, but we can look into supra-individual factors that are beyond individuals, such as policies, infrastructure interventions, or whatever things that could be beyond the individual. But there are limitations that come with positive deviance. Among those limitations is that limitations with big data. And among those limitations is that big data is decontextualized data. And in order to link back the context to this digital measure, we need to complement it and augment it with traditional data sources. It also captures one dimension or few dimensions of performance. And to have a holistic understanding of the performance, we would also need to complement it with additional sources. And finally, if big data or digital data sources can explain what is happening or who our PDs, we would need additional sources of data, such as thick data and interviews and surveys, to understand why they are outperforming. So in a nutshell, if we're going to compare positive deviance with data-powered positive deviance, in positive deviance, it relies mainly on traditional data, surveys, interviews, and observations, while in the data-powered positive deviance, we're looking into both traditional and non-traditional data. When it comes to the performance measure in positive deviance, it's manually recorded or observed, while in the data-powered positive deviance, it's digitally recorded and observed. If we're looking into performance and how we are capturing performance, in the positive deviance approach, it's a snapshot of the population. It follows a cross-sectional design where you look at performance at an instance of time. But in the data-powered positive deviance, you can look at or observe performance over time. And when it comes to the units of analysis, in positive deviance, you look into individuals. In the data-powered positive deviance, you can look into groups or geographical units such as villages or districts. And finally, when it comes to explanatories of positive deviance, when it comes to positive deviance, it's mainly individual factors. But in the data-powered positive deviance, it's individual and supra-individual factors, as I said, like policies and interventions. So what are the steps that the different pilots are undergoing in the identification of positive deviance? So the first question is to identify if this is a problem that is suitable for the positive deviance approach, and if we have the data and the capabilities that are able to do this analysis. So when it comes to suitability, we need to ask, are there positive deviants? Is it a technical challenge or a technical problem that requires a technical solution, or is it an adaptive challenge that requires a change in behavior? When it comes to feasibility, we need to ask the question of, do we have the data and the capabilities that could make this a feasible approach? And when it comes to desirability, it's important to make sure that we are not harming the observed units and there aren't any negative unintended consequences. When it comes to determining positive deviance, which is the next stage, it's important at the beginning to identify a performance measure, a digitally recorded or observed performance measure that could help us or indicate the desired outcome that we're looking for. And then comes the idea of the homogeneous grouping. So why do we do the homogeneous grouping? As we go larger when it comes to the coverage of population, more heterogeneity arises in our sample, and accordingly, more likelihood of confounding variables. And to be able to achieve a core element of the positive deviance, which is identifying positive deviance within a similar context or creating the sameness element, we have to divide this population into groups that are having similar structural contextual variables. This increases the likelihood at the end of the road that the factors explaining positive deviance are behavioral and individual factors. And finally comes the stage of PD identification, where we identify PDs within those homogeneous groups, and then we do PD validation by using additional sources of data before going to the field. So if you look at it, it's more of a funnel. So we start with large populations where we are able to measure their performance digitally, and then we go narrower into a homogeneous group within this population. And then within this homogeneous group, we identify positive deviants, and then we validate those positive deviants before going and doing the labor and time-intensive qualitative inquiry. There is an extensive use of non-traditional data in the early stages, and then there's a more extensive use of traditional data in the later stages. And the next step after going to the field will be to discover the underlying practices, design interventions to amplify and scale those practices, and finally, monitoring and evaluating those practices. So I will now leave space to my colleagues to tell you more about the Mexico pilot.
Thank you, Basma. Basma, there's a question on the chat if you can share your paper. Maybe you can respond to that. So thank you for introducing us to the method. So we know there's a lot of technical terms here, performance measurement, homogeneous grouping, and all of that. And to make it a bit more sort of practical, you'll now hear from the team in Mexico how they actually apply the method. But just to say, and I put it in the chat as well, we'll be sharing more and more about the method, how it works, how you can apply it in your work maybe over the next few weeks. So we'll show one more of that. So now I hand it over to the team in Mexico. So there's Gabriela Rios, who is the head of exploration at the UNDP Accelerator Lab Mexico. There's Alejandra Cervantes, who is a technical advisor of the 2030 Agenda Initiative at GIZ Mexico. And there's Alma Rangel, executive director at Codeando Mexico, and Itzel Palma, data analyst in Codeando Mexico. Over to the four of you.
Thank you, Andreas. Let me quickly share my screen. I hope you can all see it now. Again, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this webinar. And today we're going to talk about the pilot project in Mexico that pretends to identify public spaces that are safer for women in Mexico City. First of all, here are the institutions that are running this pilot in Mexico, with a local team integrated by UNDP Mexico Accelerator Lab, represented by Gabriela Rios, and GIZ in Mexico, represented by me, Alejandra Cervantes, and Codeando Mexico, represented by Alma Rangel and Itzel Palma. Also, it's important to mention that this initiative also has the support of the global team of the UNDP Accelerator Labs, the GIZ Data Lab, and the University of Manchester Center for Digital Development. And to start with the presentation, I think it is important to set the scene and give you some context on why is it important to talk about women's safety in the public space in Mexico. And in this slide, you can see 6 figures that I believe showcase this issue. First of all, 2/3 of all girls and women above the age of 15 report having experienced at least one incident of violence in their lifetime. On average, 11 women are killed every day, and those between the ages of 20 and 24 represent the majority of these victims. Also, in 2019, more than 50% of the homicides of women occurred in the public space. And talking about public spaces, almost 70% of the attacks that occur on these spaces are mainly sexual, including catcalling, bullying, stalking, sexual abuse, rape, and attempt of rape. And I think it is also worth mentioning that Mexico City, the most populated city in the country, is among the states with the highest levels of community violence against women. And we can say that these figures are just the tip of the iceberg, as 78% of women and girls over 15 years old do not report on violence incidents. Having said that, violence against women in the public space is a social, urban, and economic problem that negatively impacts women because, first of all, it limits their freedom of movement and restricts their right to the city. Also, it limits women's access to work, education opportunities, the access to essential services, the possibility to participate in cultural and leisure activities, and of course, their full participation in public life. Therefore, the objective of this pilot is to identify areas or public spaces in Mexico City where women are safer and explain the reason of this by using the data-powered positive deviance method. In this slide, you can see the step-by-step we are following with this pilot, starting with the understanding the problem and mapping the data to run this method. And we are now in the step of identifying positive deviance, as it is highlighted in green. And just briefly mention that in the initial phase, it was necessary to better determine or understand the problem from different perspectives. So we conducted a series of interviews with experts representing different sectors and with relevant experience on violence against women and violence against women in public spaces. This provided us with initial guidance on factors that make a public space safer for women, including, for example, urban and security infrastructure, use of the space, mobility, the presence of people, among others. And additionally, this was very important for us to start mapping some of the public and non-public data sets for the analysis. And now, after this very short introduction, I hand it over to my colleagues Alma and Gabriela to explain the steps and the analysis conducted even further.
Thank you, Alejandra. So, hey everyone, thank you for coming today. I'm going to explain a bit more of the technical journey we have taken with this project. So the pilot, in a nutshell, it's basically happening in Mexico City. The time frame we are using is from January 2019 to March 2020. Our unit of analysis is AHEB, which is here in Mexico, a basic geostatistical area used by our National Institute of Statistics and Geography. And our positive deviants are AHEBs with lowest crimes against women. We focus on public spaces within the AHEBs. So do you want to, next, Alejandra? Thank you. So to talk, I'm going to go step by step. First, there was a very big work of mapping the data. Luckily, in Mexico, we have like a lot of public data. We managed to identify 67 databases that were related to the problem and dived into the work of analyzing them and understanding which ones were the most important. So what we came up with was like a snapshot of the different variables we could use within each of the stages of the project. So next, Alejandra, please. So basically within homogeneous grouping, we used population density, marginalization index, and the influx of daily trips to work or study from women moving around the city. During PD identification, just so everyone remembers, PD is positive deviance. We are using types of roads, distance from the center of the AHEB to the nearest subway and metro station, which is our main modes of transportation, public transportation in Mexico City, stops of other public transports, green areas, border with the state of Mexico, because Mexico City has a very large border with the state of Mexico, and the state of Mexico has also a huge problem in terms of security. So that was relevant in this instance. Commerce, financial services, education services, restaurants and bars, recreational services, population, the area of the AHEB, the population divided by age or groups of ages. And in this particular instance, we also have data on how many female headed households we have per head. So we also added that one. And this particular variable was also relevant during the interviews Alejandra and Gabby were able to make before we started with the technical aspects of the project. And in PD understanding, we're using distance to the nearest police station, buttons, speakers, panic cameras, Wi-Fi totems, and safe pathways, which the city provides. So as you can see, homogeneous grouping are more structural variables, and we get to PD understanding, they're more behavioral. So next, Alejandro. The next stage was defining a unit of analysis. For those of you who know Mexico City and for those of you who don't, Mexico City is a very, very large place. And in this particular project, using the data positive power deviance methodology, we're not dealing with people or with communities, we're dealing with public space. So we really had to think what was the best way to look at the city. The city has different geographic units. A HEVS is the one you're looking at in the map we put here in the slide. But we also have neighborhoods, we have districts, and one of the things we considered, because we have information at block level, was actually building a geographic grid. But after analyzing the databases we had, like running them down to the variables we identified, we made the decision to use a HEVS because it was a measure small enough to have enough observations to run the project, but also it was a measure that allowed us better to use the data because most of the data we had, we could use at this level. So this is how we determined there's 2,431 HEVS in Mexico City. And then we went to homogeneous grouping, which Basma explained a little bit when she was explaining the methodology. Just so you know, we use these 3 structural variables to build our homogeneous groups, which is socioeconomic lag, population density, incoming trips of female population. We did several exercises or explorations of how would be the best way to build the clusters, but after running a random index, we identified these 3 as the most relevant variables to build this homogeneous group. We ended up with 4 clusters. You can see in the table above, basically the different values for each of the variables. So cluster number 1 has a very high number of HEVs, 2 medium, 3 high, 4 low. But what's interesting here is like checking out the population density, the incoming daily trips of female population, and the socioeconomic lag. One thing that's very important to know or consider here is that the variable we're using for socioeconomic lag is actually, it actually considers a lot of other variables in this particular variable. So that's why, even though we only have 3 structural variables, we're considering several things within this homogeneous grouping. So next, Ale, we ended up with these 4 clusters. This is how you can see it in a map. Cluster number 1 are HEVs that attract more women daily to work and study, and it has the highest socioeconomic level. Cluster number 2 are highly populated HEVs that do attract women to work and study and have high socioeconomic status, but it's not as much as cluster number 1. Then cluster number 3 are the most populated HEVs with medium income level and also a medium level of women traveling daily to work and study. And cluster number 4, which you can see like in the outskirts of the city, are the poorest HEVs that do not attract women to work or study. Normally, the women from these HEVs actually move to the center, and they have low density population. Yeah, so defining performance measures. So I'm giving it over to Gabby. Gabby?
Oh, sorry, I was muted.
Yeah, sorry. Okay.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so the next step was to find a measure of performance to identify the outperforming or positively deviant AHEBs, which means those spaces with the lowest amount of crimes against women. And in order to do this, we needed to define the data that we were going to use to do that. So we chose a data set of victims in investigation files of the Attorney General's office, which covers 2019 and 2020. So these are the investigations, the ongoing investigations about crimes that happened against women. We know that in Mexico, there is a high number of crimes that go unreported. This is known as the dark figure. Those are crimes that, many crimes are not reported or are not subject to a prior investigation, and therefore they do not appear in any statistics. We are aware of the limitation that this poses, but this is the only existing data set that offers the fields of information that we needed in order to build a performance measure. We chose it because it offers many fields of information that are really valuable to us. For instance, the type of crime, the day of the week when the crime occurred, the time of the day, the age of the victim, the gender of the victim, which is really important for this project. And there are other data sets that do not have the gender of the victim. And also very important, the geolocation of the occurrence. This is very important because it makes it possible for us to associate the crime numbers to the respective AHEBs or geostatistical area that we are using as the unit of analysis. Nevertheless, the city has other mechanisms for reporting crimes, and we are in the process of adding that data to our analysis. However, what we are going to show you in this presentation only focuses on the dataset of the victims in investigation files of the Attorney General's office. So once we selected the dataset that we were going to use, the first step to build our performance measure was to define the universe of crimes that we were actually going to use for our analysis. So since the focus of our pilot is in public spaces, we selected crimes that we know that only happen in public spaces. Those are the crimes that, for instance, say robbery to passerby on subway, on the street, and so on. And also we selected crimes, gender violence crimes that the literature tells us that could or tend to happen in public spaces, such as sexual assault, femicide, and rape. In this particular project, we excluded domestic and family violence because they tend to occur in private spaces. So after that, next slide, please, Ale. After that, we set out to categorize the crimes according to their psychological and physical impact, because here we have crimes that are from femicide to robbery without violence. So we really wanted to divide it according to their grade of severity and depending on the psychological and physical impact that they have on women. So we defined 3 different categories. In severity 1, we have the crimes that threaten life and aim to damage the physical and sexual integrity of women, such as attempt of femicide, rape. In severity 2, we have the crimes that have post physical and psycho-emotional violence, but they do not threaten life. So here, for instance, we have sexual assault, but we also have robbery with violence. And finally, we have severity 3, which are those crimes that don't have any type of physical violence, but may have some psycho-emotional impact. So these are different types of robberies to passerby and passengers without violence. And here it's important also to emphasize that we want to test if we can find different positive deviants within one category, or if we find the same positive deviants across the 3 categories. And in that case, when we conduct fieldwork, we could identify if there are distinctive factors that are conducive to more or less severe types of crimes. So that's why we also decided to come up with these 3 categories.
Yeah, so we're currently in the stage of identifying positive deviance. For PD or positive deviance identification, we're using 4 dependent variables, which you can check here, which is crime severity number 1, crime severity number 2, and crime severity number 3, which Gabby just explained, and all crimes combined. and 25 independent variables divided in these three categories, which is geographic area, that covers the area of the hub, the border, urban infrastructure, and population. We can see the urban infrastructure and population in the next slide. Ale? So yeah, in terms of urban infrastructure, we're using commerce, financial institutions, educations, which means these actual places like markets, supermarkets, ATMs, banks, schools and universities, museums, restaurants and bars, hospitals, personal services, which include like hairdressers, laundry, funeral. These categories are actually from survey from our National Institute of Geography and Statistics. Green areas, roads, distance to public transportation. This means the nearest distance from the centroid. Other public transportation stops. And in terms of population, the head population, female head households, male population, female population, grade retention, and age groups, and influx of people at the end. So if you can go to the next one, Ale. We did several explorations of different models. The last three we used are linear regression, the lasso linear regression with selection, and the negative binomial with selection. These are the PDs we found with each of the models. We have not, we finished this just last week, so we have not defined which one is the one we're going to use. But yeah, so in each model, we have like the general model, and we run it by cluster and by crime severity. A couple things that are important to understand is that both linear regression and the lasso linear regression are using victim log as the result variable, but the negative binomial is actually using the total amount of investigation folders. And yeah, a lasso and negative binomial use like selection. They have selection and linear regression doesn't, but we're still in that stage of discussing amongst ourselves and with a lot of help from Basman, the global team, which would be the best one to use going forward. Yeah, next, and I'll give it over to Gabby.
So as Alma mentioned, we're still analyzing and defining which model we are going to use. However, we wanted to show you some of the places that we've been identifying as positive deviants. So for instance, this one is a positive deviant that we identify for cluster 1, the one that attracts more women daily to work and study and with the highest socioeconomic level. For those of you who know Mexico City, this is in Tlatelolco, an apartment building, and this is a residential area. So for instance, this is a PD that turned out in the 3 models for all crimes. Next slide, please. This one, for instance, is in cluster number 3, which is the most popular HEBs with medium income level and a medium level of women that travel daily to work and study to these areas. This one is a PD that showed in 2 different models, and it's a combination. Those of you who know Mexico City, this is in Candelaria. So we have here various types of spaces. We have subway station, bus station. You can also see a photo of a public park and also apartment buildings. And finally, the 4th example that we found in cluster number 4, this is a PD that showed up for severity 3, which are all the robbers to passerbys without violence. It showed up in 2 different models. And this is downtown Mexico City, and it's also a combination. Well, we can find, like public squares, and this is a very commercial area. Next. So what's next? After we define the model that we are going to choose to see with which PDs we move forward, we are going to use more data to understand the positive deviance that we identified using different data that we have. And some of the variables that we are going to use here is, for instance, the distance to the nearest police station, the location of panic buttons that are installed throughout the city, security cameras, and green areas. So we're going to do that, and then afterwards we're going to move forward. Next slide, please. To the fieldwork part. Here, what we still need to do is to do the research design. We're probably going to use a mixed method combined of observation and mapping of the spaces that we identified, and also interviews, both probably to passersby and to people that live there. We'll conduct this both in positive deviance AHEBs, but also in non-positive deviance AHEBs. And we will focus on conducting our research on the public spaces that we can find in these areas. And then afterwards, we'll analyze all the information and we'll design some interventions that we want to test on the field. Interventions that will be both informed by government stakeholders and make some public policy recommendations, but we also want to look into the solutions that the communities that live in these spaces are using, so that we can also make some recommendations and interventions informed from the community perspective. So we'll leave it at that there. Yeah, that's it for now. And we're happy to open the Q&A.
Thank you so much. And we're opening now for questions, as Gabi just said. Feel free to ask questions about the pilot, how the team went about the data analysis, but we feel also free to ask questions about the method if any of the terms are unclear to you and how you actually do go about homogeneous grouping and all of that. So feel free to do so. I know there's been a few questions on the chat, and some of them might have been answered on the chat, but if there's Alejandra, Gabi, and others, if you want to respond to those questions, then please do so. Maybe one question that I'd like to ask before we go into that is about your positive deviant case, because some of the audience might be familiar with the conventional PD approach, so positive deviant approach, where positive deviant is actually an individual, and the behavior makes that positive deviant a positive deviant. So in your case, a positive deviant is a public space. Can you say a few words about that and how that makes it maybe easier or more difficult for you to go to do all the analysis?
Sure, and I can start, and then Ale, if you want, you can jump in. So this is one of the particularities of this pilot, that we're focusing on public spaces. Whether it makes it easier or harder, I'm gonna say a little bit harder, but we'll see. Especially when we go to the research, to the fieldwork part, we are going to have to identify or control for many different aspects. So there we will have a combination of interviewing people, but then also conduct some sort of mapping or inventory of the elements that are in the urban space, which can also be related to whether or not an area is more prone to crimes. So, and there's a lot of literature on that and methodologies as well to conduct like an inventory of public spaces to see whether there are some visual elements, elements that block like the visibility, like for instance, bus stations, but also things that have to do with the quality of the space. So for instance, if it's dirty, if it's painted, if it's in good shape, and so on. So we are going to be able, or we hope we'll be able to analyze and identify many different components that would help us have a more holistic approach to the problem. Mm-hmm. Ale, I don't know if you want to add something.
Yeah, I agree with Gabi. I think we want to go beyond the elements that make a public space safer, according to literature and according to the experts that we interview at the beginning of the process. as Gabi mentioned, lighting, cameras, etc. But we also, I think the difficult part here is that we are going to interview or to talk with people using those spaces that we identified as positive deviants, and we also have to be aware of how the perception of security that they have and how their behavior let's say match with how the public space is performing. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, I think it will be interesting to see what you get from the qualitative data collection and from the quantitative data, and if that matches or there's any sort of discrepancies, and how you can actually combine the two. There's a question here by Peter Kumberger on what were the most important variables with respect to classifying an AGEB as a positive deviant?
Yeah, so I was answering there, but the most important variables. Do you want to go, Itzel?
Yeah. Yeah, we found in the third model, we found that population of the AGEB is a very important variable. Also, the area of the AGEB, the bars and restaurant services also were very, very important, and the financial services, the number of financial services in the AGEB. Also, the distance to the nearest subway and metrobus station from the center of the AGEB were very important. Also, these variables were important not only in the third model, but also in the first one and in the second of the linear regression and linear regression with lasso selection variables.
Okay, there's another question. Sorry, how are you going to go about ethical issues of not stigmatizing locations that are negative deviants, and also ensuring that PDs are not interpreted as violence-free places, as violence is everywhere? That's a good question. I don't know who wants to take that.
Okay, I could start. So, okay, as for the second part of the question, how are we going to ensure that PDs are not interpreted as violence-free places, but as violence is everywhere? We want to choose PDs that, that's also a discussion that we've been having. So we're going to select PDs that are, probably like surrounded by areas where there is crime, because we know that a lot of crimes go unreported. So it could be a bit, like confusing or misleading if our PDs are spaces that don't have any recorded crimes, because then we would have to question ourselves, is it because they are not being reported or because they're actually safer? So I think what we are going to use to select is PD spaces or locations that are surrounded or by places where actually crimes are occurring, so that we can actually learn from them. And PDs are also going to be most likely going to be the spaces where there are crimes that are recorded, but in a lower amount of than in other places. And as for the first part of the question regarding how are you going to go about ethical issues for not stigmatizing locations that are negative deviants, that's definitely something that we're going to have to consider when we move to the phase of to design the research for the fieldwork. I would say it will also have to do a lot with how we communicate the results, so that we don't stigmatize these locations.
Okay, thank you, Gabi. There's another question by Resti on the data collection and how you actually went about it. Questionnaires, pre-survey to produce data sets of the maps. Essentially, how did you manage to collect or access data for your pilot?
Okay.
We're very lucky because we actually have our National Institute for Statistics and Geography. They have a lot of data, a lot of open data, and also the Mexico City government has a lot of open data. So we didn't conduct a pre-survey for the specific data we're using for the models, but it was just open data we were able to access through open data portals.
Okay, and a question by Raphael. Could you expand on the selection variables in the models? I'd love to know what with selection actually means.
Yes, for the linear regression, we use the lasso technique that it is the least absolute string cache and selection operator. It's a way of penalize some variables that are not important for the predicting for the dependent variable. So the coefficient turns to 0. So we just run the model with the most important variables, with fewer variables. And then for binomial negative, we did a selection model that also selects the more important variables with a package in R called MOMIN that tests thousands of combinations of variables, and they select the better models with the better AIC, with the lowest AIC, AIC criterion information. So we choose the better combination of variables for each one of the models. That was the types of selection models that we use.
Okay, okay. In the meantime, while others are maybe putting more questions here, I'll ask a question, a less technical question, but more so about the so what and what's next. So assuming you find, and we can already see that you actually succeeded at, assuming you find positive deviant public spaces, then what comes next? You know, who might benefit from that, and how do you go about that?
Yeah, okay, so the next step is that we want to engage further with both decision makers, both in government, academia, civil society, and so on, so that we can design interventions that we can pilot in other places in the city that have similar characteristics, so that we can make some public policy recommendations. And as I mentioned, we also want to delve deeper into the solutions that the community is producing. So depending on the AHEBs that we identify, where we're going to conduct fieldwork, the way that we tap into the knowledge of the community could take various forms. Like it could be only through ethnographic research, fieldwork that we conduct, but also we are thinking about conducting some research on social media. So perhaps there's something that we could find on Facebook or on Twitter that could help us see what type of solutions that communities are, the women of these communities are implementing. So there is where we are headed. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Gabby. And just a follow-up question on that, to what extent is that different from, you know, how organizations such as, you know, development organizations typically approach such problems? How is that a different experience also for you, maybe in a team of, using data to find solutions instead of understanding problems and defining problems better through data? How is it different from your, say, other projects that you're working on?
So I would say that one part is that through the data that is already out there, the open data that we are, very lucky that in Mexico City there's a lot of data available. For once, we're able to cover the whole city, and the city is very, very heterogeneous. So I think one contribution that this method has for understanding this problem is that we can analyze the whole city and being able, hopefully, to pinpoint to very particular issues or components that are influencing the situation of gender violence in public spaces. And also, I think what is also very rich is the combination of analyzing all this quantitative data and then producing and combining it with thick data so that we can also have a more holistic comprehension of the problem.
All right. Any other questions, anyone? Feel free to raise your hand or to speak up or put them in the chat. Either to the team here, and Gabi, Alejandra, Itzel, and Alma, or maybe to Basmo on the method. I'll give you another 10 seconds before. Or anything you'd like to share, looking at the team here, an all-female team, by the way, which is not as common for a data project. So very, very happy to see that. Okay, if that's not the case, then thanks so much for the presentation, and I'll hand it over to Catherine for wrapping it up. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everybody. Another female wrapping up here. So thanks, everybody, for participating. Before we actually close this round, I just wanted to draw your attention to Andreas Glucker, who is usually doing this wrap up because he's the mastermind within GIZ of data-powered positive deviance. So he's on a well-deserved vacation, and but he will be involved in any further follow-up. So Jeremy will post a couple of links in the chat right now with how you can get in touch with us, how you can get in touch with the different teams. You've heard from Basma that she can share the paper if you give her your email address. And also if you heard for the first time about data-powered positive deviance, and if there's more you want to discuss, or if this inspires you to try and test it in another in another context, then we're here to discuss and here to help. We are very happy to have Rafael here posing a lot of questions, actually, which were basically very much to the point of our, sometimes also our pain points, who will do some positive deviant work in India. So it's growing, and we'd love to hear more from you in case you're working on something and learning from us. Then there is just two more announcements to make. There will be the videos of the past webinars will be made available. The UNDP comms team, as far as I know, is working on it. And there will be our fourth webinar, and this will be on Niger. And Jeremy, I guess you've already, or can you share the link and everything on the Niger pilot? It will be in Niger. We are looking at how we can ensure food security through sustainable agriculture. So this will be again on behavior and not spaces. And yeah, so without further ado, looking forward to seeing many of you maybe in on Thursday, and to hear back from you with your comments, etc. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye.